So we're standing in the NHS Museum, and NHS is a parent company of a bunch of skateboard brands you may be familiar with: Santa Cruz, Indy, OJ, Mob Grip, Creature. We celebrated our 40th anniversary in 2013, and we wanted to celebrate with something special. Of course, we've been around 40 years, a lot of artwork, a lot of stories, a lot of artifacts, and many brands, but we decided to focus on the first 20 years of our company, and we decided to focus on 3 brands that pretty much are the foundation of NHS, and that was Santa Cruz Skateboards, Road Rider Wheels, and Independent Trucks. All started in the 1970s. The story goes, the beginning of NHS was there were 3 founders, Richard Novak, Doug Hout, Jay Sherman. So they were distributing raw materials. They sold some raw materials to a guy in town. This guy basically burned them, didn't pay for the bill. So they went back over there, they collected the raw materials, and they collected pretty much of anything in value that the guy had, and they brought it back to NHS. A friend in Hawaii gave him a call shortly after that and said, "Hey, skateboarding is really booming over here. Can you make us 500 skateboards for McCully's bike shop?" McCully Bike Shop bought 500. They bought 500 more. They bought another 500, and then they stumbled into the skateboard business. They quickly got out of the surfing materials business because it wasn't making them any money, and they were in the skateboard business. So the beginning of Santa Cruz is kind of more of a club. We've got some artifacts here that are airbrush t-shirts. It's kind of a neighborhood gang type of skateboard team, I guess you could say. Skateboarding back then really wasn't organized. It was more regional. Santa Cruz had their thing, Dogtown guys had their thing, San Diego guys had their thing. It was just all kind of a region. But from Santa Cruz Skateboards, they got into the Road Rider wheel business. The story behind Road Rider is a gentleman walked into their surf shop on 41st Avenue with a prototype for a urethane wheel with a precision bearing. Urethane wheels before then had loose ball bearings. They made a lot of noise. This guy had an idea to put a precision bearing in a wheel, super quiet, easier to take care of. Richard Novak, Jay Sherman, and this guy named Tony Roderick all got together, created Road Rider. They sold 18 million wheels in a couple of years. It revolutionized skateboarding because prior to then it was loose ball bearings that had a lot of problems. And they just took all that Road Rider money and they dumped it back into Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz at the time was a lot about racing, slalom, downhill, cross-country skateboarding. Racing was probably from 75 to maybe middle of 78. Then the whole skateboard business shifted over to bull riding. Santa Cruz just followed that trend, and as you walk through the museum, come over here, and it's more product for bull riding, product for skate parks. Boards got wider, wheels got a little bit larger, and different formulas. And so we're walking through, you get the beginning of skateboarding, Santa Cruz, you got Road Rider, you move into this sort of middle to late 70s section. Skate parks were starting to pop up all over the country. This is kind of where I say NHS kind of got their act together. We started working on logos. We started working on brands. We were the first company that realized skateboarders didn't want to have the same kit, top to bottom. They didn't want a Santa Cruz deck, Santa Cruz truck, Santa Cruz wheels, Santa Cruz grip tape. They wanted individual brands. That was sort of Jay Sherman's vision of what a company should be. This section, it's more contest related in the Hester Series. So the Hester Series was 1978, 1979. What a lot of people don't know is that NHS privately funded the Hester Series. We donated money to it secretly because, again, Jay and Rich thought that to have an industry, you had to have a formal competition piece to it. So this is kind of highlighting the Hester Series and NHS's involvement in the first bull riding contests. Hester Series turned into the Gold Cup Series, then it turned into the NSA Series throughout the 80s. So NHS could take claim that they've started one of the first bull riding contests. Then we go into the next section of the museum. It's all about independent trucks. Again, back to that multi-branded, multi-category strategy. They felt they had decks and wheels pretty covered. They didn't have a truck brand. They were buying trucks from Tracker Trucks and other people. So they met two individuals up in San Francisco. It was Fausto Vitello and Eric Swenson. And those two camps came together. Richard and Jay, Fausto and Eric, they started Independent Trucks in 1978. And that quick story is Ermico, which was Fausto and Eric, they were kind of working on truck designs that were more like automobile suspension. At the same time, Jay and Rich were working on a suspension truck as well. Neither of them really worked on their own until the founders got together and created the first independent truck. And the name independent comes from independent suspension. The first Indy truck, the wheels were independent from each other. Racing, it worked great. If you rode a set of independent trucks, you were winning everything, even if you weren't that good of a skater. But racing died and it all turned to bull riding, and a suspension truck didn't work for bull riding. So they went to a straight axle truck, and I'd say within a matter of a couple of years, Independent became the #1 truck in 78, 79, and it's been the #1 truck ever since. A lot of history to Indy. The logos are all here. These are original drawings and photography of ads of some of the original Indy ads. The story behind this logo was Jay Sherman, who was sort of the art director at the time, and I should say creative director. Jim Phillips was the art director. They got together and they wanted to create a logo for independent trucks. They looked at surfing culture, and they were both surfers, and there was sort of this iron cross, surfer's cross they used to call it. Back then it was really prevalent in 60s and 70s surfing. They started with sort of an iron cross. They kind of kicked that around. The iron cross was a little too attached to sort of Nazi and sort of negative stuff. So they decided to round that logo out, and that's where we kind of get into these more rounded logos. They played around with independent suspension in the lettering, but you can kind of see all these sort of comp sketches of different ideas. The cross hadn't even really come into play while they were still trying to figure it out. And then Jim Phillips walked in with the surfer's cross, and they determined it was a little too crazy, and they went into a more rounded version of it, still having a surfer's cross sort of element to it, but pretty much the logo we see today. And then it went into different variations of that logo. So it was Jay Sherman and Jim Phillips that created that logo together. Independent Truck Hall of Fame. These are the guys that really established Indy in the 80s. Probably our heyday as far as independent trucks. And it was another unique thing that Jay and Rich came up with, was creating brands that could cross other companies' lines. So they didn't have to ride for NHS as far as a deck company goes, but they could ride for independent trucks. And you could be on Sims, you could be on GNS, you could be on whatever. And it was pretty novel of creating brands that could cross other sponsorship lines. And you see that in our products. Mob Grip, huge team. Independent Trucks, huge team. Ricta Wheels, top names. They started that concept in the 70s, and a lot of people duplicated that in the 80s, and then you can see it today. So the next section is the museum, is what I call the dark period, and we're trying to create this feeling of when skateboarding crashed. Skateboarding crashed in 1980, 81, 82. It literally, the industry died, the skate parks closed, there was a lot of problems with liability issues. The magazines went out of business. We had Skateboarder magazine was our Bible. It turned into Action Now, which was sort of this confusing skate, surf, snow, fashion. They had horseback riding in it. It was, if you were a skateboarder and it came in the mail, it was almost like the most offensive thing that there was no longer a skateboard magazine. Action Now soon went out of business for obvious reasons. They meant nothing to skateboarding. So unfortunately, Jay died in 1980. He passed away from leukemia. That was another part of this dark period where not only did the industry crash, but Richard's partner passed away. So multiple levels of being kind of a sad period for NHS. But when the magazines went out of business, Richard, Eric, and Fausto, the remaining founders, they wanted to start a magazine. And they started Thrasher Magazine together. So this sort of era here is like the dark period, and we kind of move into what we call the rebirth of skateboarding. They started Thrasher Magazine. There's a little bit of a explanation here about that period. And when the magazine started, skateboarding started to come back, and I really give a lot of credit to Richard and Fausto and Eric for basically putting the industry on their backs and trying to recreate something that they weren't quite done with. They didn't think that skateboarding had finished everything that it needed to do. So they really helped rebuild the industry. And out of the magazine, then it kind of went into what I call the Phillips graphic explosion. So about 84, 85, everything started heating up. The magazine was going off. Other skateboard companies were coming back or being launched. NHS had Santa Cruz and Indy and OJ. That was kind of their main things. And pretty much the independent trucks in the magazine was sort of the catalyst of rebuilding this entire industry, and we kind of went back into Santa Cruz becoming real popular again. Jim Phillips, the main artist in that period, he had a definite style. It was a heavy keyline style, heavy inking style. And we just rode that through the 80s. He created some of the most iconic graphics. We had some of the most iconic skaters at the time. And if you're familiar with 80s skateboarding, it was pretty much Powell Peralta, Santa Cruz Skateboards, and Vision. And those three companies sort of dominated. And each of them had their own image. Powell Peralta was definitely clean and almost sort of like not very offensive. They wanted to be very accessible. Vision was a little bit more glam and rock and roll. They had these guys that were basically rock stars. They really wanted to promote this rock star thing. And Santa Cruz kind of had this bad boy image. Maybe the Oakland Raiders are sort of like the, screw it, we're going to do anything we want kind of attitude. And it worked because the industry had three different vibes. They kind of fought off each other and worked together. Jim Phillips area, there's some original inkings and pencil sketches and drawings here. A lot of these are the original boards straight from the pros. A lot of the pros donated things that were important to them. So there might be a helmet here, a t-shirt, a pair of knee pads, elbow pads. And as we're building the museum, we started getting more and more contributions. And it's a proper museum. A lot of these items still belong to the people who donated them, but they're here on display. And yep, this is the Phillips section. In the 80s, we made hundreds of boards. We can't show them all here on the wall. So we created a little board cloud up here. It's got other boards that maybe didn't appear on the wall. And then we have this digital rotating display of all the artwork. And a lot of collectors like the different colorways. Like the Rob Roscott might have came in 6 different colors, and we tried to display that here. In the final section of the museum, there's a sort of a film and video room. You can come in here and sit down and see some pretty rare footage, never been seen before. A lot of 16 millimeter film, a lot of things that we found through collectors or people had stuff in their garage, and we put some film up on the wall. So the museum, 20 years of NHS, Santa Cruz, Road Rider, independent trucks, a lot of history, a lot of artifacts. We're really proud of it. We give tours, private tours, but you can just email us and set up a tour and come on by and see the museum. We'd love to see you, and thanks for coming by.
basically my first and oldest sponsor. I guess I've been with NHS since 2000. Started out on flow like most people and then worked my way up through AM status.